Did you know Richard Pryor's 1977 comedy spawned one of hip-hop's most controversial hits, featured a platinum healing glove as a prop, and was actually a remake of an Italian political satire that nobody in Hollywood wanted to touch? From bizarre makeup secrets to unexpected cultural impacts that lasted decades, this overlooked Pryor film holds surprises that will completely change how you see this cult classic. Fact 1. The first black triple role. When Richard Pryor stepped onto the set of Which Way Is Up in 1977, he was about to make film history in a way that nobody really talked about at the time. Pryor became the first black actor in cinema history to play three completely different characters in a single movie, a groundbreaking achievement that would later inspire comedians like Eddie Murphy to build entire careers around similar transformations. The three roles Pryor tackled were wildly different from each other, showcasing his incredible range as a performer. He played Leroy Jones, the main character who's a poor orange picker, caught up in union politics and romantic complications. Then he transformed into Rufus Jones, Leroy's sexually obsessed father who's constantly chasing women and causing trouble around the house. Finally, Pryor took on the role of Reverend Lennox Thomas, a hypocritical preacher who ends up having an affair with Leroy's wife and getting her pregnant. What made this achievement even more remarkable was how Pryor brought each character to life using different voices, mannerisms, and physical transformations. The father character, Rufus, was actually based on Mudbone, one of Pryor's most popular stand-up comedy personas that audiences already knew and loved from his live performances. The Reverend character also came from Pryor's comedy routines, meaning he was essentially bringing his stage work into a feature film format. While actors like Peter Sellers and Danny Kaye had played multiple characters in films before, Pryor was breaking new ground as the first black performer to attempt this kind of showcase. The technique required extensive makeup work and costume changes, but more importantly, it demanded that Pryor completely inhabit three separate personalities within the same story. This pioneering approach would later influence Eddie Murphy's career-defining performances in movies like The Nutty Professor and Coming to America, where playing multiple characters became a signature move. Fact 2. Italian political satire remake gone wrong. Which Way Is Up started life as something completely different from the Richard Pryor comedy that audiences eventually saw in theaters. The film was actually an American remake of The Seduction of Mimi, a 1972 Italian masterpiece directed by Lino Wertmuller that dealt with serious political themes like fascism, labor unions, and corruption in post-war Italy. The original Italian film starred Giancarlo Giannini as Mimi, a Sicilian metalworker who gets caught up in a complex web of politics, sexual relationships, and social commentary. Wertmuller's version was a sophisticated satire that used comedy to explore how ordinary people get crushed by powerful political and economic forces. The movie tackled issues like the mafia's influence on elections, the struggle between workers and management, and how political corruption affects everyday families. When Hollywood decided to adapt this story for American audiences, something went terribly wrong in the translation process. The screenwriters essentially took Wertmuller's original script and used it almost word for word, but they systematically removed anything that seemed too complicated or politically challenging for American viewers. All of the sharp political commentary about fascism got stripped out, and the sophisticated labor union themes were watered down into basic sitcom-style jokes. This bizarre approach left the movie in a strange middle ground where it kept the basic plot structure of the Italian original, but lost all the deeper meaning that made the story worth telling in the first place. Critics noticed this problem immediately, with many pointing out that the film felt like it was missing its soul. The cutting social satire that made Wertmuller's version so powerful was completely gone, replaced with what reviewers described as dumb 1970s TV sitcom jokes that didn't match the complexity of the original story at all. Fact 3. Hip-hop's unexpected sample source. 12 years after Which Way Is Up hit theaters, a scene from Richard Pryor's comedy would become the foundation for one of the most controversial rap songs in hip-hop history. In 1989, the Miami-based group 2 Live Crew sampled audio from the movie for their explicit hit, Me So Horny, making this the only Richard Pryor film to contribute to a landmark legal battle over free speech and obscenity in music. The sample came from an early scene in the movie where Leroy, played by Pryor, is listening through the wall to his father Rufus, also played by Pryor, having sex with a woman in the next room. The sounds of their intimate encounter, including phrases like "Don't do that, baby" and "Sock it to me," along with various moaning sounds, were lifted directly from the film's soundtrack and woven into 2 Live Crew's song. What made this connection even more bizarre was that 2 Live Crew also sampled dialogue from Stanley Kubrick's serious war film Full Metal Jacket for the same song, creating a strange musical mashup that combined Richard Pryor's comedy with one of cinema's most respected directors. The hip-hop producers took these movie samples and layered them over a heavy bass line from the 1979 funk song Firecracker by Mass Production. The resulting track became a massive hit, reaching number 26 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the rap charts. But it also sparked a nationwide debate about censorship and artistic freedom. Florida prosecutors actually took 2 Live Crew to court over the song's explicit content, leading to arrests and a legal battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Through this unexpected chain of events, Richard Pryor's 1970s comedy became forever linked to one of the most important free speech cases in American entertainment history. Fact 4. The mysterious platinum healing glove. One of the strangest visual elements in Which Way Is Up was a shiny platinum healing glove worn by Reverend Lennox Thomas, Richard Pryor's hypocritical preacher character. But despite decades of film analysis and interviews, no one has ever explained why this bizarre prop was included in the movie. The glove appears during several church scenes where the Reverend is supposedly performing miraculous healings on his congregation, creating one of the film's most memorable and absurd visual gags. The platinum glove stands out as particularly odd because it doesn't appear in the original Italian film The Seduction of Mimi that served as the source material for the American remake. This means that someone involved in the Hollywood production specifically decided to add this strange accessory as part of the Reverend's costume design. But their reasoning has been lost to time. What makes this prop even more mysterious is how it fits into the broader character of Reverend Thomas, who is portrayed as a corrupt religious leader more interested in seducing women than actually helping his parishioners. The healing glove becomes a symbol of his phoniness, suggesting that he needs fancy equipment to perform miracles rather than relying on genuine faith or spiritual power. Film historians and Richard Pryor biographers have never found any interviews or behind-the-scenes documentation that explains who came up with the idea for the platinum glove or what it was supposed to represent. The prop doesn't connect to any particular religious tradition or healing practice that was popular in the 1970s, making it seem like a completely random addition to the character's wardrobe. Viewers who remember the film often cite the platinum healing glove as one of the details that stuck with them years later, proving that sometimes the most inexplicable creative choices can become the most memorable parts of a movie, even when nobody can explain why they were included in the first place. Fact 5. Stand-up characters come to life. Richard Pryor didn't create all 3 of his characters from scratch for Which Way Is Up, because 2 of them were actually beloved personas that audiences already knew from his legendary stand-up comedy performances. The father character, Rufus Jones, was directly inspired by Mudbone, one of Pryor's most popular stage creations, while the corrupt Reverend Lennox Thomas came from another familiar character that Pryor had developed during his live comedy shows. Mudbone was a recurring character in Pryor's stand-up routines, who represented an older, streetwise black man with strong opinions about life, love, and survival. This character allowed Pryor to explore themes about generational differences and the wisdom that comes from hard-earned experience, often delivered through hilarious and sometimes crude observations about relationships and society. When Pryor transformed Mudbone into Rufus Jones for the movie, he kept the character's sexually obsessed personality and his blunt way of speaking about intimate matters. The Reverend character also had roots in Pryor's comedy work, where he frequently created personas that exposed the hypocrisy of religious leaders who preached moral behavior while living completely different private lives. Pryor's stand-up audiences were already familiar with his ability to portray corrupt preachers who used their position of authority to take advantage of their congregations, making this movie role feel like a natural extension of his stage work. This approach of bringing established comedy characters into a feature film was unusual for the time period, as most actors kept their stage personas separate from their movie roles. By incorporating Mudbone and his Reverend character into the film, Pryor was essentially giving his longtime fans a chance to see these beloved comedy creations in a full narrative context, complete with costumes, sets, and interactions with other characters that weren't possible during a live stand-up performance. Fact 6. The film that made $19 million. While movie critics were busy tearing apart Which Way Is Up, For its confused plot and watered-down social commentary, audiences were lining up at theaters and making it one of the biggest box office successes in black cinema history. The film earned $19 million during its theatrical run, which made it the highest-grossing movie featuring predominantly black actors and themes that had been released up to that point in film history. This financial success was particularly remarkable because the movie received overwhelmingly negative reviews from professional critics who complained about everything from the weak screenplay to the dated soundtrack. Major newspapers described the film as a cultural mess and criticized director Michael Schultz for having the raunchy vitality and comic subtlety of a subway graffiti artist, yet none of this bad press seemed to hurt ticket sales at all. The $19 million box office take proved that Richard Pryor's popularity with audiences was strong enough to overcome poor critical reception and questionable material. Moviegoers were apparently willing to pay to see Pryor perform, even when the movie itself wasn't particularly good, demonstrating the incredible drawing power he had during the peak of his career in the late 1970s. This commercial success also helped establish a pattern for black-oriented films during that era, showing Hollywood studios that there was a profitable market for movies featuring black stars, regardless of what white critics thought about the quality of the final product. The financial performance of Which Way Is Up encouraged studios to continue investing in projects with black actors and directors, even though many of these films would also receive mixed reviews from the mainstream press. The movie's box office achievement became even more significant when it helped director Michael Schultz land his next major project, proving that commercial success could sometimes matter more than critical approval in Hollywood's decision-making process. Fact 7. Marcello Mastroianni's rejected role. Before Giancarlo Giannini became internationally famous for playing Mimi in Lina Wertmüller's The Seduction of Mimi, the lead role was actually offered to one of Italy's most celebrated actors, Marcello Mastroianni, who decided to pass on the project entirely. This rejection turned out to be a career-changing moment for Giannini, who was still a relatively unknown actor studying at the National Academy in Rome, when Wertmüller gave him the opportunity of a lifetime. Mastroianni was already an established star in Italian cinema by 1972, famous for his collaborations with director Federico Fellini in classics like La Dolce Vita and 8½. His decision to turn down Wertmüller's offer meant that she had to look elsewhere for someone willing to take on the challenging role of a Sicilian metalworker caught up in political corruption and sexual complications. According to Giannini himself, no other major Italian actor wanted to play the lead character after Mastroianni declined the part. The role required the actor to portray a somewhat crude and unsophisticated working-class man, which may have seemed less appealing to established stars who were used to playing more glamorous or dignified characters. Wertmüller had already noticed Giannini's talent after seeing him perform in 2 plays, including one by the French playwright Molière, and she had previously cast him in smaller roles in musical movies featuring pop singer Rita Pavone. When she offered him the lead in The Seduction of Mimi, Giannini jumped at the chance, later saying he leaped at it without hesitation. This casting decision launched Giannini's international career and began a successful partnership with Wertmüller that would continue through several more films, including Love and Anarchy and Swept Away, making Mastroianni's rejection one of the most consequential casting decisions in Italian cinema history. Fact 8. The backwards opening credits mystery. The opening title sequence of Which Way Is Up features one of the strangest visual effects in Richard Pryor's entire filmography, with a dog and clothes hanging on a line that appear to move back and forth as if someone is playing the film footage forward, and then in reverse several times before the camera finally zooms in to start the actual movie. This bizarre editing choice creates an immediately disorienting effect that leaves viewers wondering if something is wrong with the film projection or if the strange movement is intentional. The sequence shows what appears to be a normal backyard scene with laundry drying on a clothesline and a dog wandering around. But instead of playing this footage in a straightforward manner, the filmmakers chose to make everything move in an unnatural back-and-forth pattern. The clothes sway one direction, then suddenly reverse and sway the opposite way, while the dog seems to walk forward and then backward in a motion that defies normal physics and animal behavior. This opening effect was clearly deliberate rather than accidental, since it would have required careful editing and planning to create the reverse motion sequences and then combine them with the forward-moving footage. The technique gives the entire opening a dreamlike or surreal quality that doesn't match the tone of the rest of the movie, which is primarily a straightforward comedy with realistic settings and situations. No interviews with director Michael Schultz or any of the film's editors have ever explained why they decided to include this unusual opening sequence, or what they hope to achieve with the disorienting visual effect. The backwards and forwards motion doesn't connect to any themes in the story itself, and it's never referenced again during the rest of the film, making it one of those mysterious creative decisions that seemed important to someone during production but has never been properly explained to audiences. Fact 9. Director Michael Schultz's career peak. The commercial success of Which Way Is Up turned out to be the highest point in director Michael Schultz's career, directly leading to him being offered the chance to direct Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1978, with the largest budget that had ever been entrusted to a black director up to that point in Hollywood history. This opportunity came about because entertainment mogul Robert Stigwood was impressed by how well Schultz had handled the Richard Pryor film and wanted him to take on an even bigger project. Schultz had already established himself as a successful director of black-oriented films with movies like Cooley High and Car Wash, but Which Way Is Up proved that he could deliver significant box office returns even when working with material that critics didn't particularly like. The $19 million gross demonstrated his ability to connect with audiences and manage commercial projects, which made him an attractive choice for studio executives looking to invest in expensive productions. The Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band project was a massive undertaking that featured music by the Beatles and starred the Bee Gees along with Peter Frampton, representing a completely different type of filmmaking from the urban comedies that had made Schultz's reputation. The fact that he was chosen to direct this high-profile musical showed how much confidence the industry had gained in his abilities after seeing the financial success of the Pryor film. This career trajectory highlighted how box office performance could open doors for directors in ways that critical acclaim sometimes couldn't, since Which Way Is Up had received mostly negative reviews but still generated enough profit to convince producers that Schultz could handle major studio projects. The move from directing Richard Pryor comedies to helming a Beatles-inspired musical represented one of the most dramatic career shifts for any director during the late 1970s. Fact 10. Lost Los Angeles locations. Which Way Is Up accidentally became a time capsule of Los Angeles transportation history when filmmakers shot key scenes at the Greyhound terminal located at 560 South Los Angeles Street, a building that would be completely demolished and repurposed within just 15 years of the movie's release. The terminal served as the backdrop for the pivotal scene where Richard Pryor's character Leroy arrives in Los Angeles via bus, marking the beginning of his new life in the big city and his transformation from a small-town orange picker to a corporate manager. The Greyhound terminal at this location was the main hub for interstate bus travel in Los Angeles during the 1970s, serving as the primary arrival and departure point for people traveling between cities across the American West. The building represented an important piece of Los Angeles infrastructure that connected the city to the rest of the country through affordable public transportation, making it a natural choice for a scene about a working-class character starting over in a new place. By the early 1990s, changes in transportation patterns and urban development led to Greyhound moving their operations to a different location further east in the city. The original terminal building was then converted into garment manufacturing shops, completely changing its purpose and eliminating all traces of its former role as a transportation center. This transformation means that Which Way Is Up serves as one of the last visual records of what this important Los Angeles landmark looked like during its active years as a bus terminal. Modern viewers watching the film can see the original architecture, signage, and layout of a building that played a significant role in the city's transportation network, but no longer exists in its original form, making these scenes unexpectedly valuable as historical documentation of 1970s Los Angeles infrastructure. Fact 11. The Elena Fiore body double scandal. One of the most memorable scenes in the original Italian film The Seduction of Mimi featured actress Elena Fiore in a controversial nude sequence, but director Lena Wertmuller later revealed in her memoirs that the famous shot didn't actually show Fiore's body at all because she had decided the actress's buttocks were too small for what the scene required. This behind-the-scenes decision remained a secret for years until Wertmuller chose to discuss it openly in her autobiography, creating an unexpected scandal about one of Italian cinema's most talked-about scenes. Elena Fiore was a respected character actress who appeared in several of Wertmuller's films during the 1970s, often playing supporting roles that showcased her dramatic abilities and strong screen presence. The nude scene in The Seduction of Mimi was intended to be a pivotal moment that emphasized the sexual themes running throughout the story, but Wertmuller apparently felt that Fiore's natural physique wouldn't create the visual impact she wanted for this particular shot. Rather than rewrite the scene or find a different way to film it, Wertmuller made the decision to hire a body double whose physical attributes better matched her artistic vision for the sequence. This meant that while audiences saw Fiore's face and acting performance throughout the rest of the movie, the most famous and widely discussed scene featuring her character was actually performed by someone else entirely. The revelation that such an iconic moment in Italian cinema involved deception created debate about directors' creative control versus actors' dignity, especially since Fiore herself had never publicly discussed the use of a body double. Wertmuller's willingness to reveal this information years later in her memoirs demonstrated her characteristically blunt approach to filmmaking decisions, even when those choices might be considered controversial or potentially embarrassing to the people involved. Fact 12. Pryor's most underrated performance. Despite Which Way Is Up being one of Richard Pryor's most complete showcases as a performer, film critics and biographers have consistently ignored or dismissed this movie when discussing his career achievements, even though many fans and industry insiders believe it represents his fullest range of talents captured in a single film. Most biographical accounts of Pryor's work focus heavily on his concert films like Live on the Sunset Strip or his popular collaborations with Gene Wilder in movies like Silver Streak and Stir Crazy, but they rarely mention this triple-role performance that demonstrated his dramatic versatility alongside his comedic genius. The oversight becomes even more puzzling when you consider that Which Way Is Up allowed Pryor to display skills that his other films never fully explored, including his ability to create completely distinct characters with different voices, mannerisms, and personalities, all within the same story. While his movies with Gene Wilder were commercially successful and entertaining, they typically cast Pryor in supporting roles that limited his screen time and creative input, whereas this film put him front and center for the entire running time. Several film scholars and Pryor enthusiasts have argued that this movie actually showcases better acting than his more famous collaborations, pointing out that playing 3 different characters required much more technical skill and preparation than his usual single-role performances. The movie gave Pryor the chance to demonstrate his range by switching between a naive protagonist, a sexually obsessed older man, and a hypocritical religious leader, each requiring different physical transformations and emotional approaches. This critical neglect has created a strange situation where one of Pryor's most ambitious and technically challenging performances remains largely unknown to casual film fans, while his less demanding but more commercially successful movies continue to define his legacy in popular culture and academic film studies. Fact 13. The faux disco soundtrack disaster. The musical score for Which Way Is Up became such a glaring problem that film critics spent more time complaining about the soundtrack than they did analyzing Richard Pryor's performance, with many reviewers declaring that the faux disco Hollywood standard soundtrack was actually worse than the confused plot and weak screenplay. The music was so painfully out of step with both the story's rural California setting and the mid-70s time period that it created a constant distraction throughout the entire movie, pulling audiences out of scenes just when they should have been focusing on Pryor's comedy. The soundtrack represented everything that was wrong with Hollywood's approach to disco music during the late 1970s, when studio executives were desperately trying to capitalize on the popularity of films like Saturday Night Fever, without understanding what made that music work in the first place. Instead of hiring composers who understood the disco genre or using authentic songs that fit the movie's themes, the producers apparently commissioned generic dance tracks that sounded like pale imitations of real disco hits. Critics were particularly harsh about how the music clashed with the movie's supposedly serious themes about labor unions and social justice, noting that it was impossible to take any of the political commentary seriously when it was accompanied by cheesy synthesized beats that belonged in a completely different type of film. The disconnect between the soundtrack and the story became so obvious that reviewers started using it as evidence that nobody involved in the production had a clear vision for what kind of movie they were trying to make. Even fans of Richard Pryor, who enjoyed his performance, found themselves cringing whenever the music swelled during dramatic moments, since the artificial disco sound made serious scenes feel like parodies and comedy scenes feel forced rather than natural, creating an overall viewing experience that felt disjointed and unprofessional. Fact 14. Echo Park's graffiti covered staircase. The romantic scenes between Richard Pryor's character, Leroy, and Lonette McKee's character, Vanetta, were filmed at Echo Park Lake in Los Angeles, where the filmmakers captured footage of a graffiti-covered staircase that accidentally became a fascinating historical record of 1970s street art and urban culture in the city. These jogging and park scenes were meant to show the developing relationship between the two characters as they spent time together in Los Angeles, but the background details ended up preserving visual elements of the neighborhood that would change dramatically over the following decades. Echo Park was a working-class area during the 1970s that reflected the social and economic conditions of many Los Angeles communities during that era, and the graffiti visible in the movie scenes represented the authentic street art culture that was emerging in urban areas across the country at that time. The tags, drawings, and writing on the staircase weren't added by the film's production designers, but were already there when the crew arrived to shoot, meaning that viewers today can see actual examples of how people were expressing themselves through unauthorized public art during this period. The filmmakers probably didn't realize they were documenting anything historically significant when they chose this location for the romantic scenes, but the graffiti captured in these shots now serves as a time capsule that shows what Los Angeles street art looked like before it evolved into the more sophisticated forms that became popular in the 1980s and beyond. Modern viewers watching these scenes can observe the styles, techniques, and cultural references that were common in graffiti culture during the mid-70s, including the types of markers and spray paints that were available to street artists, and the particular aesthetic choices that defined this early period of urban artistic expression. Fact 15. The cultural translation that failed. The screenwriters for Which Way Is Up made the bizarre decision to use Lina Wertmüller's original Italian script almost word for word, but they systematically removed anything they considered too idiomatic for American audiences, which meant that all of the sophisticated political irony and cultural commentary got replaced with generic TV sitcom-style jokes that had no connection to the story's deeper themes. This approach created a script that kept the basic plot structure of the Italian masterpiece while completely gutting everything that made the original story intelligent and meaningful. The original Seduction of Mimi was filled with sharp observations about Italian politics, labor relations, and social corruption that were specific to the cultural context of early 1970s Italy. But instead of finding equivalent American references or updating the commentary for a different audience, the Hollywood writers simply deleted these elements entirely. They apparently believed that American moviegoers wouldn't understand or appreciate political satire, so they chose to dumb down the material rather than trust audiences to follow more complex themes. This disastrous translation process left Richard Pryor in an impossible situation where he had to work with a script that had the bones of a sophisticated European art film, but the actual dialogue and jokes of a weak television comedy. Critics noticed that Pryor seemed to be improvising much of his performance, padding scenes with his own comedic material because the written script didn't provide him with enough quality content to work with. The result was a movie that felt like it was constantly fighting against itself, with Pryor's natural comedic instincts trying to compensate for a screenplay that had been stripped of its original intelligence and cultural specificity. Many reviewers commented that the film would have been much better if the writers had either stayed completely faithful to Wertmüller's vision or created an entirely new story instead of attempting this awkward middle ground.